All right, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's having a great day today. I have to say, I don't know who thought it'd be a good idea to stick these cafeteria tables here, but you're not going to get lunch served by me afterwards, so hope you didn't get your hopes up for that. Anyway, a couple announcements, and then we'll jump into the content today. So I went ahead and put in the 2 points to your final grade for doing the McGraw-Hill survey. Thanks to those of you who did that. I certainly appreciate the feedback, and McGraw-Hill does as well. So you should see inside of Canvas, if you completed the survey, you should see where it lists course bonus points inside the grade book. What I will do is after tonight, so sometime tomorrow, probably the morning, but we'll see, I will recalculate your grades, so you'll have an idea of where you stand leading into the final. So basically you have, of course, the Unit 3 quizzes due tonight inside of Canvas. Certainly encourage you to do those whenever you get a chance. So it's going to be chapters 12, 11, 8, and 6. So, like I say, once all that's done, tomorrow, I will recalculate the grades. You should see the 2 points reflected into your grade. You should also see any other bonus points you've earned. Should already be reflected in, certainly. Beyond that, I do have a survey that I sent out today. It's completely optional. I'd encourage you to fill it out, especially if you're in the room and you don't want to ask a question in front of everyone. But if you have a question, we only have a handful of responses to it. I'm certainly willing to take literally any question anyone has. So certainly encourage you to do that. Just to remind everyone, of course, course ends today. This is the last official day of courses meeting if they're Tuesday, Thursday. If they're Monday courses, I think they still meet next Monday. Double check the academic calendar. But I think tomorrow is the last day for classes unless they're Monday only. So certainly keep that in mind. The reading day is that next Tuesday. And then I think finals start on the 22nd. 22nd at 11 or 12:01 a.m. You'll be able to start this final if you choose to take it at that time. It's up to you whenever you take it during that window. It is mandatory, it is cumulative, and it counts for at least 20% of your course grade. Just like the other two exams, 20%. But unlike the other two, since it's cumulative, it can replace either exam 1 or exam 2 if you do better on exam 3. So, does that make sense to everyone? So basically what I'm going to do, like I said before, I'm going to calculate it with 3 different ways. The first way is to count all the exams at 20%. Second way would be to count the first exam at 0%, second exam at 20%, third exam at 40%, and then the third way would be to count the first exam at 20%, second exam at 0%, third exam at 40%. So whichever one of those ways is higher, that's going to be your exam average. Apart from that, any questions before we jump into the material today? So it is going to be a short lecture today. We'll be talking about cloud computing a little bit. It's a Technology Guide 3. It's only a couple pages in the back of the book. So what we'll be covering today, a little bit about cloud computing, some different types of clouds you may see, different services that can be run on cloud computing, benefits, as well as drawbacks. So just kind of introduce this a little bit. A lot of the stuff we've talked about up to this point has been considered on-premise computing. Last class we talked about networks, and we talked about client-server architecture. And mostly we assume that we're talking about client-server architecture within inside of a particular firm. So everything's locally hosted. That's not always the case. So today we'll be covering cloud computing, and in cloud computing, really the only distinction is where is the server infrastructure located? Is it located on company premises? Is it located at a third-party site? If it's located at a third-party site, it's cloud computing. If it's located on premises, it's on premises. So certainly keep that in mind. There's some really big advantages that cloud computing provides firms. The first one being, you're not locked into whatever specific capacity you have. So imagine you go out and you purchase a server. It has X amount of processing capacity. You can express that in a lot of different ways. Teraflops is a common measure. I'm not going to test you over how it's measured, but just know that you have some specific capacity with physical hardware that you own. And that number doesn't change. If anything, it can decrease with certain overhead. Another case in which it decreased, there's recently, of course, a lot of CPU vulnerabilities, and they were patched in a way that would decrease the performance. So performance can't really ever increase beyond things like overclocking, which is not common on server hardware. So it's not something you'll likely see. It's more common on enthusiast-grade hardware. which certainly has no place inside of an enterprise environment. So, with cloud computing, though, we're not limited to one specific amount. So depending upon the contract that we have with our cloud computing provider, we can actually get a dynamic amount. So maybe from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., we need X amount. And maybe from 5 p.m. till 8 a.m. in the next morning, we only need to have X minus whatever constant we want to apply there. So we can certainly have that flexibility and scalability, as opposed to having a rigid amount of infrastructure that really can't change without capital infusion. So that's going to be very beneficial because that can have lower cost for us. Now, how does it work for the cloud computing provider to be able to provide that? Well, does every business have the same operating hours? They don't. And beyond that, even if they did, does every business exist in the same time zone? They don't. So it's very easy for the cloud computing providers to be able to scale their infrastructure to be able to better serve people and whatever their needs are. Reliability, this is one that, is something to consider. It's not necessarily inherently more or less reliable to have cloud computing. There can certainly be lots of downtime that you could experience, and there could be downtime that you experience with on-premises. You do lose control with cloud computing. Generally speaking, you're not likely to find a contract at a reasonable price, at least, that allows you to deduct for lost time. Now, what you will find are contracts that allow you to deduct and have, instead of getting money back, you'll get service time back. Common ratio would be something like 15 minutes gets you 24 hours back. So 15 minutes of downtime, 24 hours. Another common ratio would be 1 hour gets you 24 hours of time back. So you're not likely to see a contract where you have a financial penalty. Instead, you'll be granted a sort of service contract there. So an extension, basically. So that's something to consider. Certainly having virtualization available is another beneficial thing. 20 years ago, it used to be that if you wanted to run a server, you had to have a physical server as opposed to having a space to install something. And what I mean by that is you have one server for one application. So if you wanted to host an application for your employees to use, you had to dedicate a piece of physical hardware, at least one. A lot of times it'd be more than one, but you'd have to do that. Now with virtualization, you can instead purchase one server, and you can install virtual instances on the server and allow for multiple things to be installed on it. It's a really bad idea to have a server where you have a single operating system installation for multiple purposes. A lot of reasons for that. Main one being, what if something breaks? What if something goes down? Well, if you have one single instance of that for several purposes, then that means those several purposes are now inaccessible as opposed to that one thing. So virtualization is very easy to minimize that risk. And then lastly, of course, if you're using cloud computing, it goes without saying you have to have network access. Now that's not just network access in terms of a local network, you have to be able to reach the internet. So that could certainly be a downside where it could not even be your provider, your cloud computing provider that's having a problem, could be your internet service provider. So that's an additional layer of complexity that you have to consider when you're determining whether or not it makes sense to use cloud computing. So a couple of different types of cloud computing. We, of course, have the public cloud, and we have private cloud. Now, how those differ is, with public cloud infrastructure, you're going to be on a piece of hardware, and there could be other firms on the same piece of hardware. Now, they will be using a virtualized instance, and hypothetically, you won't be able to access anything. But the downside of that is, there's a lot of vulnerabilities at the hardware level that could be exploited if you have access to an instance like that. So, generally speaking, if you have highly sensitive information, you're not going to want to put it on a public cloud, even though your public cloud hypothetically should be safe. In practice, it's likely not going to be safe. There's a very famous example of a private cloud where I believe it is the, let me think for a second. It's a government agency, not defense related. It's Department of Justice, that's what I'm thinking of. Department of Justice has a contract with Amazon to have a private cloud infrastructure because they don't trust a lot of the information to be stored on what other people could hypothetically potentially access. Now, a hybrid cloud is going to be a cloud in which sometimes you can request for the hardware to be dedicated to you. Other times, you can say, I don't care. So it's just kind of looking at how public or private is this information going to be. Is it going to be on a piece of hardware that only the firm has access to, or is it going to be on a piece of hardware that other firms could also rent out part of? So that's all we're talking about there. It'd be like if you had a building and you could stick a cubicle inside of it, and other people may also be able to stick a cubicle inside the building as well. And cubicle is not necessarily the most secure thing. You can certainly, a lot of times, jump over the walls and enter a cubicle, even if there's a lock on the door. So it's that same type of thing, where you have a private building that only you rent, or you're inside of a shared building where other companies also have cubicles. So does that make sense? Okay, so here's a little comparison, and this is an important graph. You don't have to memorize it, but certainly it's important to understand the order of this. So we have on-premises, and basically we're showing that the firm is responsible for 100% of everything. So you have two different colors here, managed by customer, managed by vendor. So the customer is going to be this sort of yellow golden color, and then the orange color is going to be managed by the vendor. So the vendor in this case is going to be a cloud computing provider. So on-premise is completely managed by the firm itself. And then as we move up towards software as a service, we see that the firm has less and less control. So when we see infrastructure as a service, we see that the vendor, in this case a cloud computing provider, is really only managing the virtualization itself. So they're giving someone a completely blank instance on side of a server, and they're saying you can install any operating system you want, any software you want, any sort of things you want. Then you contrast that platform as a service. Platform as a service, you're saying, we're not giving a completely blank slate. We're giving you an operating system already installed, but you can install any applications, you can put any data on it that you want. And then lastly, we have software as a service where literally everything is controlled by the cloud computing provider. So basically, they're just hosting an application, and you access the application, typically through a web browser, but it doesn't have to be through a web browser. A lot of times there can be standalone applications used to access that. So basically what we see is as we go from on-premise to software as a service, the firm loses control over how the installations are done and all that, but the cloud computing provider gains that control. So is there a good approach that we would always take? Of course not. It really depends upon the organization, what sort of needs they have, what's the purpose of them using it in the first place, and lots of other things like that. So certainly keep that in mind. That's what we're talking about here. So benefits, the main one is going to be cost savings. So if you're a small firm and you had to hire a full-time IT employee to manage not just internal hardware but also software, it can get very costly because sure, it's not very difficult to find someone who can do hardware maintenance. It's not very difficult to find someone who can do software maintenance, but to find someone who can do both at a reasonable price and a lot of times in a very limited geographic area, that can be very challenging for a firm to do, especially if they're a smaller firm with lower resources. So cloud computing can step in and say, well, the firm doesn't have to be responsible for anything. They can just basically say, we're going to pay this bill, and then we have access to it. So that's one of the main advantages there, particularly for smaller firms. Also think about the scalability. If you can have, this sort of infrastructure where you don't have to have a fixed capacity, that's huge. You can grow, not have to worry about purchasing additional equipment. You can constrict and not have to worry about having equipment that's not being used or utilized at 100%. So you can really kind of scale to your individual needs, not just even within a day, within an hour. That's a huge advantage that not every technology can provide. So, really just those sort of advantages there, huge. But so there's certainly going to be a lot of concerns and risks with this. One of the main ones being a legacy IT system. It's not very uncommon to see a legacy IT system that requires older versions of software or maybe even older versions of hardware to run. And that could be doing anything that the firm needs. There's certainly lots of cases of this happening. And it can be very difficult to work with a cloud computing provider to have an instance available because then they could be held liable. Now, of course, there's lots of ways to remove that liability and to have, things like memorandums of understanding where, both parties agree. But in general, if you're exposing something to the internet, it's not going to be very likely that someone's going to be willing to host an outdated version of software because it probably has a substantial number of exploits that are well known and well used. So generally speaking, it's going to be very difficult to have legacy software supported on cloud computing applications. Because if it's locally done, it doesn't have to ever touch the internet. So that can be a huge advantage. It can be completely air-gapped from any outside exposure. Reliability, that can certainly be something to be concerned with because you don't have that control. With an internal system, if it breaks, it's your fault. There's no really denying that. But if it's an external system, there could be a lot more pointing the fingers as opposed to fixing the problem. Privacy, like we talked about, public clouds. It's not exclusive to your firm. In terms of the piece of hardware that stuff is on, there could be exploits run that could potentially compromise information. I'm not saying that'll happen, but it could happen. Security, we kind of covered that. Regulatory and legal, there could be cases in which a external cloud computing provider does not meet whatever regulations you're required to meet. So if you are in the healthcare industry and you have a cloud computing provider that doesn't meet the standards that HIPAA requires, that could be a big problem for you. So to address that, of course, you'd use something like a memorandum of understanding, service level agreement, to make sure that both parties are in agreement about what is required for whatever you're wanting to have. It's all going to be specified within the contract. Then, of course, criminal use. That could be a problem with an internal or external system, but it's certainly something to consider for an external system. So I want to give you all the opportunity to get 2 bonus points on the exam 3. So if you're watching this after the fact, I will give you until reading day, whenever that is. So basically 24 hours. Let me think. Yeah, I'll give you until Monday at 11:59 p.m. if you're watching this after the fact. But if you're in here right now, I'd certainly encourage you to fill this out. It's a really quick survey. It's 2 points on exam 3. So give you all a couple minutes to do that. And also, while you're doing that, also be thinking of any questions you may want to ask for the review. I got 4 responses so far to the other survey that I emailed out to everyone. So I would certainly encourage you to think about that if you want to submit something. I'll be sure to refresh it before we dismiss. But apart from that, just kind of keep that in mind. Anyone still navigating to the survey? All right, like I said, it's fine if you continue to fill it out. If you need to get the link to it after class, let me know. But I'm going to go ahead and move on. So we're just going to wrap up real briefly. We talked about cloud computing, talked about how it's used, benefits, and drawbacks. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and move into the review. So like I said, if you need that link, let me know after class or whatever. So I sent out this Excel spreadsheet that lists pretty much every term that you need to know for the exam. So the final exam is, of course, cumulative, so anything from Unit 1, 2, or 3 you'll likely see on the exam. So if you have any questions about this, feel free to ask me right now. Also, I'll be sticking around a couple minutes after class, and in just a minute here, I'm going to go over the survey responses and go over any questions asked in that. So anyone have any questions they want to ask right now? Yeah. I'm pretty sure there's exactly 135 questions. It'll be multiple choice. You'll have 3 hours to complete it. So once you open the exam, that timer will start counting down. So I'd recommend doing pretty much everything you could need to do before you start a 3-hour exam. I apologize for that, but with it being virtual, I want to make sure that everyone knows about 80% of the content. You should still have some additional time to look into maybe 20% of the questions if you don't know them. I'd certainly recommend you have your textbook handy if it's a virtual book. Make sure you can search through it quickly. Make sure you have any other notes you took, anything like that. Make sure it's all handy before you start it. Any other questions I can address right now? Yeah, there'll be some overlap. So if you want to review your previous exams, see me after class. Or beyond that, you can schedule an appointment with me before the reading day. After the reading day, I will not be reviewing exams until after the final exam window is complete. So certainly keep that in mind. It'll be a very similar format. There will be some of the repeated questions. There will be some new questions, of course. It shouldn't be anything, that you haven't seen in general. It should certainly align pretty well with what we covered in class. So does that answer that? Any other questions I can address before we jump into the survey responses? Do you have a question? So the final exam is just the entire final exam testing window from the university. It's going to be starting at 12:01 a.m. on 4/22, and it'll be closing at 11:59 p.m. on 4/28. Now don't wait until 11:58 to start it, because I'm pretty sure it's set up to be due at 11:59 p.m. on that day. So if you started it then, you'd only have like a minute to do it. That's no good. So certainly would encourage you to give yourself that full 3 hours. But unless you wait until the last day, that's not a problem at all. So, any other questions? All right, let me take a quick look at the survey responses. Let me just refresh them real fast. It's taking just a little bit of time here. Sorry about that. Okay, so the first question, do you recommend we rework all the McGraw-Hill homework as a studying tool? I personally wouldn't recommend that. I think that'd be quite a bit of work. I'm not even sure if you can, to be honest with you, but if you could, I think that, it's important to remember that it's a beta test right now of the McGraw-Hill. That's why it's free for this semester. It only has about half the content built out already, so I think in total there's actually 8 units. I only assigned 6 of those 8 that are available. It's not really the textbook that the course is based on. Textbook is still based on Introduction to Information Systems, so I recommend you pick it up pretty cheap online. Older versions are fine. In terms of the content, though, there's going to be a lot of overlap with it. I would say you'll probably see maybe 50 to 60% overlap. The main reason it's not much higher is because, like I say, only about half of the course is built out inside of the McGraw-Hill platform. So I personally wouldn't recommend that you spend a whole lot of time in there. You certainly could. But the main thing I would do if I were you, I would just go through this Excel spreadsheet, look at all these terms. If you don't know them, figure them out, because there's a pretty high chance you'll see these on the final exam in some way. So that'd be what I would recommend. This is going to be the highest likelihood of being on the exam of anything we've covered in class. So, literally, the way I make this is I pull up the exam and I get all the terms and I put them into a spreadsheet and sort by order. So you're pretty likely to see stuff like that. Second response, is the Excel spreadsheet stuff going to be on the exam? So I think there's a couple different ways I can interpret this. First way would be this Excel spreadsheet right here with all the terms. This is definitely on the exam. The other way I think I can interpret this is the spreadsheets we've done in class. Those will also be covered on the exam. I will send out a supplemental file to go through, and it'll have the specific spreadsheet that you'll be using on the exam. If I'm not mistaken, it's going to look very much like the spreadsheets that we did in class. So I'd certainly encourage you to take a look through it and see, make sure that you can answer the questions that we did in class with it. So anything that we did in class, particularly toward the end of the file here, you should see them. So I think it's all down here. Yeah, so any of these, Excel functions, make sure you know all of them. Make sure you know the analytics terms. Make sure you know how to calculate them, what they are, how they differ from each other, all that, and you should be fine. So pretty much any Excel spreadsheet we've used in class, fair play for the exam. Our questions for previous exams going to be on the exam? Likely. I would say it's almost 100% guarantee. How long is the time frame? So it's a standard 3-hour testing window provided by the university. I wish I could make it 2 hours and make it a shorter exam, but I can't. So sorry about that. Any part of the material we should mainly focus on? It's going to be weighted relatively equally between each of the chapters. I would say the only chapter I don't have a ton of questions on is going to be the ethics chapter. But apart from that, I would just recommend looking through this entire spreadsheet. I know it's a lot of terms. You should know most of them. And the ones you don't, just make a note of them. You can, look them up. You can look up what an entity is. You can type out the definition. It's just something to kind of jog your memory. So if you're taking the exam, you can quickly see which terms you didn't know. That's the nice thing about it being open book, open note, is you can do that. So that's pretty much what I would say there. I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. So hope you all are doing well as well. When will the grades be updated for reference before the final? Great question. I'm going to do that on Friday, so basically tomorrow. Once everyone has submitted their quizzes, which are due tonight, I will update the grades so you'll have a good idea of where you stand going into the final. Basically, I have a video on my YouTube channel where I kind of go through how to calculate grades. If you want to see what grades you needed, you can certainly take a look at that. I think it's published. I think I may even have a link to it in the syllabus somewhere, but it's on my YouTube channel as well. So if you have any questions about that, I certainly recommend you check out that resource first, and then if you want to send me your grades to see if it looks good, I'm willing to take a look at them once you've done that. So refresh this. Make sure no one submitted any other questions. All right, so it looks like there's no new responses. Anyone have any other questions? Yeah. So that's a good question. I'm not going to say there won't be any where I ask what the definition is. Generally speaking, I don't like to ask that because it's something you can easily look up. It's not really anything. I'm more about asking about the application. So it'll be very similar to the previous two exams and looking at the actual application of the terms as opposed to just looking at the definition. Great question. Any other questions? Yeah, open internet, open book. The only thing is that it's not technically open classmate. So, if you're going to cheat, I wouldn't recommend putting it in writing. I don't recommend cheating at all, but I'm saying if you put it in writing, that's a very ill-advised plan. Does that make sense? So, again, I want to be very, I'm not encouraging you to cheat. But if you were to cheat anyway, because I don't want to have to deal with it. That's what it really boils down to. So just don't cheat, but if you do, certainly be very careful in how you do it. But again, I'm not encouraging it. So yeah, just don't cheat. Let's just leave it at that. Any other questions? So what I did was I forgot to press the record button on it. I apologize. So what I did was I used the previous semesters. So it's just going to be the first half of that previous semester's video. It should be inside the playlist. So that was my bad, guys. But yeah, it should be available to see the networking chapter. So it's just the first half of that. Any other questions? So yeah, on my YouTube channel, I have the different playlists posted. I'll just show you guys real fast. Well, I say I'll show you guys real fast. It doesn't seem to be wanting to do anything real fast. So yeah, you should be able to see, this is the playlist from this semester. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that I posted. Yeah, so this video right here should just be the first half of it. So should be pretty straightforward there. Any other questions? All right, well, it's been a great semester, everyone. Thanks for attending. I hope you all enjoyed it. Hope you all have a great rest of the semester. Good luck on your finals. And yeah, have a good summer, everyone.